All right, good afternoon. So I wasn't certain that I was going to create another video or record another video for this week, but I got done with the um, free speech discussions, and there's probably a couple of points worth mentioning. So one, and this is just a sort of personal idea, belief. I'm not the only one that has this idea, so I certainly can't take credit for it. I'm not the originator of it. Um, but there is a question or an idea as to whether or not social media companies are what political scientists would call the new public square, right? So if you go back and you look at history, and it's not really a history course, but I am a history professor as well. Uh, the public square was the idea of literally a place in town. It was public, where people would come and they would exchange things, and amongst those things would be ideas, right? And this is sort of a concept that I go into a lot more detail in my full semester long course, where we talk about a concept called the marketplace of ideas, and the free exchange of ideas and intellectual thought, right? And so a long time ago, this used to happen, face to face in public in a public location. Um, it frequently still happens publicly in colleges where you're looking at meetings that occur in quads or lecture halls or wherever. Um, but now the question is social media the new public square? Now, obviously, public means that it is public. It is open to everybody. It is unregulated, um, and easily accessible, right? And so that begs the question: if and it is an if, social media is the new public square, can social media companies discriminate ideologically, intellectually? Can they remove people from their platforms, right? In the public square, you couldn't be removed from the public square. It was a public space. Now, obviously, there's always exceptions to that. I mean, if you murder somebody, you go to jail, you're in prison, no longer accessible to the public space, right? But provided you've not broken any laws, there you go, right? And so obviously social media companies can write their own rules, and they have for a long time, right? For as long as they've been around, they have their own rules governing the type of speech that is permissible and things of that nature. And so frequently you get rules about hate speech and racist speech and the dissemination of misinformation and things like that, right? Um, but if it is public, if it is the public square, you actually shouldn't. And again, these are big ifs. So this is something for you to sort of think over and decide for yourself. But if it is the public square, then you shouldn't be censoring thought, right? And one of the better examples that I can give you, because we'll actually start with the concept of misinformation, right? Look at something like 5 years ago with COVID. You had social media companies that were censoring information that said COVID leaked from a lab in China, right? That was deemed to be racist and wrong and misinformation. And there were actually social media companies that scrubbed any sort of mention from that, right? I think Twitter technically had, or they called it a shadow ban, right? Where you weren't really banned, but the algorithm that was running the platform sort of made it to where you were invisible, ghosted, essentially, so that your stuff doesn't show up on anybody else's feeds, right? All because you were promoting misinformation. Okay, which then begs the question: was that misinformation, right? Because now that is actually deemed to be the likely origin of COVID-19, right? Yet 5 years ago, you could be kicked off a social media platform for suggesting that that was the origin. Um, So that's one of the issues with misinformation. Um, and then here's the other thing that I'll question you as far as this goes, right? Because now, if we are going to say, and again, I'm operating on the if that social media is the public square, right? obviously Twitter is providing the platform. They're providing that public sphere, right? They're providing that square. And if someone posts something on Twitter that says, you know, I don't know, all tall people should kill themselves, right? So I mean, obviously not something that ridiculous, but I don't want to use a real example of actual like hate speech, right? But let's just say that somebody advocated for um, a behavior that was actually harmful, right? So they're advocating for a harmful behavior. And now, interestingly enough, there's a Supreme Court case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, which was decided in the 1960s. Is actually about the KKK, whether or not the KKK can disseminate information. And the Supreme Court actually basically decided that free speech is limited only when it is inciting imminent lawless action. That's the term, imminent lawless action, right? So let's just assume, for the sake of argument here, that somebody, John Smith, posts something on Twitter that advocates for lawless action, and then that lawless action is actually committed. And John Smith is liable, right? He's not protected by freedom of speech at that point. That has already been accepted and articulated by the United States Supreme Court. Now the question is Twitter liable, right? Let's just say John Smith is some poor hillbilly from Ohio who doesn't have any money and whatever. You're not going to get anything out of him, right? But Twitter's a multi-billion-dollar corporation, right? Could you sue Twitter in a civil court and claim that you need millions of dollars for your pain and suffering? Would Twitter be liable, right? And that's a very interesting question, right? The next thing that this opens it up to, because again, once you begin operating or walking down some of these lines, then the question becomes, where is the line drawn, or at what point in time have we overstepped some sort of boundaries, right? Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that social media companies are not the public square, therefore they are allowed to discriminate. Well, now, if I just own a bookstore, right, can I discriminate? Right? Can I open up a bookstore and say that only men are allowed in my bookstore? Women aren't allowed to read, right? Let's pretend it's the 16th century, right? We don't want educated women, right? Then they'll start demanding things like equal rights, right? So could I discriminate in that regard, right? Or let's even take it the other way, right? Flip it, right? Can I what's the gym curves, right? So there's a gym that only lets women in, right? Now, men are not a historically discriminated against class in American society, therefore we don't have the same protections that women do, right? So is that level of discrimination acceptable, right? And can companies or corporations ultimately decide sort of things like that for itself, right? So I do think that those are some very interesting points that ought to be addressed. Couple of other things that I would like to at least mention. One, there are a whole bunch of you. In fact, and I had started a tally, and it got high enough that I was significantly alarmed, which is one of the reasons why I'm making this video. Of those of you that actually think speech should be regulated in at least some instance, right? That speech ought to be regulated. In fact, one person, and I'm risking hurting somebody's feelings in engaging in free speech here with what I'm about to say, right? But they made the statement that the sort of I don't know what they're called, the saying that I grew up with, right? So like when I was a kid, and people would say mean things to me, we would always reply like, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me." To which somebody said, "Words do hurt." And therefore you want to limit words. Couple of questions that then brings up. One, who gets to decide what word is hurtful, right? Like at what point Like, how do we arbitrarily draw that line? If you call me fat, I weigh 270 pounds, I'm fat, right? In fact, according to like the American Medical Association, I meet the definition of being obese, right? So if you call me fat, um, can you be penalized for that? Because that's really what we're talking about. If you're talking about limitations on free speech, limitation means there's some sort of penalty, right? That you are going to be penalized for that behavior. So if you call me fat, even though that is a factual statement, right? Or let's not even say fat. Let's use the medical definition. If you call me obese or you call me overweight, and that is what the American Medical Association would define me as, but that hurts my feelings. Can you be penalized for that in some manner? And so, sort of, who gets to create or who gets to decide what does or does not constitute um, problematic speech? We'll call it that, right? Whether that's hate speech um, or mean speech or whatever we want to call it. The reality is that if I don't have the right to risk hurting your feelings, I don't have free speech, right? I mean, the reality is, if my wife were to ever, come out of the closet in some outfit and be like, "Honey, how do I look?" and she looked like a circus clown, right? I would actually argue that it would be more detrimental to her long-term well-being for me to lie to her and tell her she looked good versus hurting her feelings in the moment and being like, "Honey, you look like a circus clown," right? If we're limiting free speech, we really do run the risk of alienating almost all speech. And I would make sort of a bold statement here, is to say that in a community, a citizenry of 340 million people, and more specifically, 340 million people as diverse as the United States is, right? Because in the United States, we have black culture and white culture and Hispanic culture and Asian culture and gay culture and straight culture and Christian culture and Jewish culture. And we have all of these different subsets, right? Um, we talked about last week with federalism, right? I mean, Alabama and California are not the same place. They probably shouldn't even be in the same country, yet here we are, right? And so when we're that diverse, I would venture a guess that almost everything then would be or could be considered detrimental or harmful or offensive to some other subset, right? Um, and so at that point, if we begin to create these limitations, it really does beg the question as to where those limitations end, right? And so I'll end by also making sure to articulate this point to you. So frequently, when we talk about our rights, um, we don't really think about them in depth, right? Um, Freedom of speech is the freedom to say whatever I want, right? Again, provided that it does not result in any imminent lawless action, right? I mean, I could say that America would be far better off had the Kardashians never existed, right? And I might actually believe that statement. Right? I might actually believe that the Kardashians are everything wrong with America today. Um, but that is my freedom of speech. Okay. Along with my freedom of speech, I also have symbolic speech that would be, um, if I wanted to. In fact, I'll use an example. I had a history teacher back when I was in high school. On Columbus Day, he used to wear all black and run around and talk about how Columbus was a mass murderer and genocidal maniac who systematically eliminated Native Americans upon arrival here. Right. That's symbolic speech, right? Wearing that black, right? You have expressive speech. There would be things like cursing or things of that nature, right? But one of the things, because a lot of us think about that, right? You can burn the American flag, that's symbolic speech. You can flip off a police officer, that's symbolic speech, right? You can wear a T-shirt that you want that might be offensive to some people. It's symbolic speech, right? You can say what you want, that's actual speech. But one of the other key components that nobody really thinks about is freedom of speech is also freedom of listening, right? And so if you're running around espousing, KKK rhetoric and talking about how, black people and Jewish people are terrible and they're a plague on society and humanity and what, I don't have to listen to that. I can make a choice as a part of my freedom of speech to not listen to you, right? And so at least a couple of you had brought up sort of harassment. Well, here's the thing, right? And again, look at like something like sexual harassment in the workplace, right? If I'm a single man working in a business or store or whatever, right? I work at Target, right? And I have a coworker, and we're friendly, and I'm attracted to her, and I hey, coworker, would you like to go out on a date sometime, right? That's not sexual harassment. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, if she says no, and then I ask her 10 more times, right, that becomes a harassing behavior, right? And so then the simple statement that was not harassment the first time eventually becomes harassment because it becomes repetitive, right? So again, if you're espousing your KKK hate, and I'm like, I don't want to listen to that, and I walk away, and then you follow me with a bullhorn and start shouting, in my direction, and you follow me all over town, that's harassment. That becomes a little bit different, right? So do understand that there's some differences there, but I do think that we have forgotten or lost the idea that freedom of speech is also entails a freedom of listening or freedom of hearing, or more specifically, a freedom to not hear or not listen. If you don't like what somebody has said on social media, and let's be honest, there's a lot of stuff on social media that is wildly detrimental to the general health and well-being of individuals, log off. Don't listen to them. Block them. Block as many people as you have to, right? But I will tell you this: when you look at algorithms and you look at the way social media companies provide information to you, a lot of the times they're providing that information to you because you're engaging with it, right? And so you have this desire to feel offended, which is then detrimental to you. I would also say this as far as that goes, because I did have somebody make the comment about, or they provided some statistic, and they didn't cite it. And as a general rule in an academic setting, you should cite anything that is sort of not common knowledge, right? So if you go out on your own and you find something, you actually ought to cite that information. But here's sort of the rub, right? They said that basically in this day and age, that depression had gone up 13%. I think there was a 13% increase in depression, and they said that was a result of hate speech on social media. There is probably well, there's certainly correlation between increases in social media and increases in depression. That's absolutely true, right? I would actually argue that there's a causation there, but the causation is not hate speech, right? And so you ought to ensure that you're not misunderstanding causation and correlation when it comes to life, right? And when it comes to data and statistics, things of that nature. 100% of the people that do not understand causation and correlation die, actually. And that is a fact, right? So if you don't get that joke, that just means that 100% of people die, because eventually everybody dies, right? So if you don't ever end up understanding causation and correlation in life, you will eventually die, but there's no causation. Your inability to understand that is not what caused your death. I don't. Again, it's hard to statistically prove this, but I will tell you this: I don't think hate speech causes the increase in depression. I think it is more of an internalized comparative nature, because so much of social media is fake. It's scrubbed. It's not real. And just between you and me, I mean, I'm a father. My own children, and granted, my children are too young for social media at this point. But as they get older, my children will not be permitted to be on social media, at least not while they're minors, because it's not ultimately good for you. It is terribly detrimental to your general health and well-being, and not just because of hate speech or because people are mean to you. Um, People used to be mean to you face to face, right? And generationally ago, Generation X, my generation, we were able to get over that. So that's just a obviously non-academic related thing. You're not. Well, one, I wouldn't try to find any y'all on social media, anyways. Right? I can't stand social media, uh, but do understand, that there's obviously some significant negatives to it, um, and that are in reality unrelated to hate speech or mean speech. I think, looking through my notes. I think. Oh, last thing. Sorry. Um, Listen, on these two, anything in this class, but more importantly, in terms of discussion. Okay. Um, and this is actually one of the problems with free speech, and I love that it showed up here in free speech. And this is probably one of the reasons why so many of you were like, "Oh, there should be limitations on free speech," because you're playing both sides, right? But free speech should be free, and it should also be limited. Well, it can't. First, it can't be both. But two, you're sitting here playing both sides of an argument, and that's ultimately counterproductive or counterintuitive. At that point, what will ultimately happen psychologically, and if you, um, gosh, if you could actually like take this class over a full semester with me and sit in a room, where there was actual discussion and discourse and lecture and actual learning. Um, One of the things that my students are always fascinated by is the amount of psychology that actually comes into political science. Um, but as you play both sides in an online discussion, what ultimately happens is people sort of only want to hear, what they want to hear, and therefore they ultimately sort of believe, well, you agree with me, we have the same opinion, and therefore no discourse actually needs to occur because we're already in agreement. When the reality is I think a lot of us, and this is actually another psychological issue, right? A lot of us speak in a manner in which we don't want to offend anybody because we don't want to be disliked by anybody. We don't want to be thought of negatively by anybody, and therefore we don't risk offending anyone. Um, I'm not telling you to intentionally offend people. That's obviously not the goal. And a whole bunch of you are absolutely correct. Like we absolutely need to be able to have more civil discourse in America. But I think one of the things, that you can't do is you can't be afraid of offending, or else you're not going to be honest, right? And again, that goes back to that example. If and it actually happened. Years and years and years ago, when I was in the Marine Corps, I came home on leave once. I have two little sisters, and so when I was in the Marine Corps, they were in high school at the time. One of them came downstairs, and I don't, for the life of me, remember what she was wearing. Um, but my mother and I were sitting in the living room, and she asked how she looked, and I gave her an honest opinion. To which my mother smacked me, in the arm and told me I was being mean. Which, yeah, it probably was. I probably could have said it nicer. I probably could have been. Marines are not very tactful sometimes, um, but I would rather be honest, and offend than be dishonest out of a fear of offense. Um, And so I would actually hope that you do that as well, especially if you're coming from a place of honesty, because I don't know very many people. I do know some who would have an intent to offend because they're just mean spirited people who are unhappy with their own lives. But as we go through this, you know, provide an honest answer on things, right? I mean, don't worry about other people's feelings if you have to self censor as a result, right? Um, especially if what you think you're doing is not intending to be offensive. Again, if your intent is to be offensive, that's different, right? Don't do that. So good luck with your essays. A number of you have already um, emailed me your cases, and with the exception of one who then emailed me two more cases that did work, nobody has set out to do a case that is wrong or that does not meet the requirements. But I would again caution you: you are writing a dissenting opinion. You must tell me why the Supreme Court was wrong. Okay? Do not tell me why the Supreme Court was correct about something. And then lastly, I would tell you that what you are doing is you are basing this upon the constitutionality of the issue at hand, right? In fact, before Jackson versus Dobbs, I actually used to not allow people to write about Roe versus Wade anyways, because I used to get a number of these papers like murdering babies is wrong. Yes, we all agree with that. That's not what Roe versus Wade was about, right? There should not be a moral argument in your paper. If your paper has a moral argument, ultimately you're not going to be great because morality is subjective and law ought not be subjective, right? Because if law is subjective, then we do not know what is or is not legal. Law ought to be subjective, right? Again, if you need help, by all means, email me. Thanks.